2017 was a year. It was so much of a year that means I have to revert back to being an original content creator and think my opinions count. How depressing, just like current year was. Haha, wow. So this year I have to inform you that this list is not opinional at all. I'm being 100% objective, and I have no biases. These are the worst games everybody hates, and I know that because I dislike them. But to be honest, most games here aren't necessarily bad, most are just disappointing or warrant some negativity. Time to make people angry and share my opinions. Yooka-Laylee, starting out at number 10, is everyone's favorite nostalgic experience. Yooka-Laylee, or should I say, haha, Fuka-Feli, haha, very, very funny. So this title wasn't necessarily bad, and I think there's some fun to be had. Some of the soundtrack is quite good, and it's competently made. However, it's the basic gameplay fundamentals that Yooka-Laylee ends up suffocating the experience with. Much of the control can be somewhat clunky, and when compared to the abundance of other collectathons out there, it falls flat. There are numerous sections that feel completely pointless, like the quiz and other parts where the camera and elements seem to be working against you. I was more so disappointed by the end result in general. After forcing myself to finish it, I was left with a feeling that I had wasted my time and gotten no enjoyment out of it. Perhaps you liked Yooka-Laylee, but for me, it's probably one of the more disappointing things to come out of Kickstarter. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Marvel vs. Capcom is pretty good in general. I'm awful at fighting games, but as a fan of Marvel and as a person who never recognized many Capcom characters, I fell in love with the intricate fighting system and fast-paced play. I think one of the most insulting things about Infinite is this DLC that limits how many cool characters you can play as, since most are sort of bland and typical. Rather than having X-Men, other Marvel villains, or any more characters, Capcom just chose to minimally implement characters with about as much depth as the Dark Elves in Thor 2. The gameplay is also pretty lackluster, with the fighting being pretty standard and not leaving much room for complexity. Throughout all my playtime, I didn't once feel incentivized to go back and try to improve myself. In that regard, it fails as a competitive fighting game, but furthering that, everything else about it is so painfully mediocre. It might be fun for a little while, only if due to the visual spectacle that any fighting game brings, but it's just not worth your time. Sonic Force is a game no one wants to play. As a self-professed lover of all things Blue Hedgehog, there was nothing I wanted more for Project Sonic 2017 to actually be good. I wanted to prove the naysayers wrong that constantly say Sonic can never work in 3D. I wanted to feel happy about the fate of Sonic after the genius work that was Sonic Made Boom: The Rise of Lyric. After a couple years of development, I'm disappointed that this was the best Sonic team could muster. A broken, boring classic Sonic style and avatar stages that played just like modern Sonics, which are, unfortunately, just as mundane. You go fast and there's very minimal input in each and every stage. It's not bad, Forces isn't as broken as some of its predecessors, but it teeters on being average to mediocre. And don't excuse this as just the boost formula not working like always, because other titles like Colors or Generations have proved that you can make this style work with interesting enemy encounters and more complex level design. The music here, one of Sonic's redeeming aspects, isn't even that great if I'm honest. The electronic and vocal tracks never struck a chord with me no matter how many times I listened to them. I just wanted Sonic to impress me, but much like my life in general, more often than not, he just lets me down. Middle-earth Shadow of War isn't bad. I think it's actually quite fun. Running around and murdering orcs in a desolate medieval world can be entertaining. As someone who grew up having nightmares about orcs after the first Lord of the Rings film, it's so satisfying to relentlessly murder these evil bastards. This is basically a better version of Assassin's Creed, with more fleshed out stealth mechanics, less following missions that are too restrictive and linear for my taste, and some kinda in-depth combat rather than just mashing buttons. However, Shadow Shadow of War took a page from Assassin's Creed that I wish it wouldn't. To get more money out of players, Warner Bros. Decided to add everybody's favorite game design element of loot boxes and microtransactions. For that reason alone, it warrants a spot here. I'm personally disappointed that a game like this had to have a system in place to milk more money out of customers. It's a bit scummy and something I wish critics would have panned more about it. I don't think Warner Bros. Should get away with it just because it's somewhat fun to play the game for a bit. This rings especially true because the later half of the game becomes so grueling and tedious that loot boxes are almost mandatory to complete the experience. It's so easy to just change a few values to make the enemies artificially more challenging and therefore coax players to choose loot boxes over grinding. But hey docs, loot boxes enhance my experience and it's okay to have them. Yeah, if you want to keep paying more money for gameplay-centric stuff, you do you. From my point of view, this is why it deserves a spot on this list. It's a pretty good game made terrible by anti-consumer practices. Life is Strange, Before the Storm. Take a game that had an admittedly interesting concept to differentiate itself from other narrative-based titles, rip it out, burn it to the ground, and you've got Life is Mediocre Before I Kill Myself, following Chloe Price with about as much depth as Plank from Ed, Edd n Eddy. You make choices in this teen drama and do absolutely nothing. Did anybody really want to know more about Chloe that wasn't already established in the first game? I think some of the charm to come out of the original was the mystery behind who Chloe was and what she was like. Sure, Max knew all about her and everybody else in that place knew all about her, but us as players, we didn't know much about her. She was developed through her relationship with Max, giving her a backstory, learning more about Rachel, and having the revelation of where Hella came from was kind of pointless since it already was thematically appropriate to keep things vague. Sometimes not everything needs to be explained. You don't have to expound on every tiny aspect of every single plot. The game is just more of a waste of time and potential. It's not a fun take on the Life is Strange universe and just adds more filler than anything. 1-2 Switch. This is easily the worst Switch game out there if I'm honest. There's almost nothing redeemable about this title, especially when you compare it to the other Nintendo console gimmick games like Nintendo Land and Wii Sports. Those titles utilized motion controls and the gamepad in ways that were more than just to show off the technical capabilities of the system. They were games you were coming back to because of how fun they were on their own. 1-2 Switch feels more like a tech demo that was published to make a quick buck because they could. I feel really bad for anyone who had to pay full price for this title. Like me, I feel really bad for myself. Moreover, 1-2 Switch lacks much content to distinguish itself from the abundance of other good titles the Switch has. Nobody buys the Switch for 1-2 Switch, and I think anybody who did would regret their decision. To be fair, it is kind of neat to show like your grandma who would be amazed that she could feel dice through Joy-Con or whatever, but that's not the best tagline for your $40 to $50 launch title. It'll keep your grandmother interested for an hour. The Walking Dead Season 3, A New Frontier, blah-dee-dee. After the genius storytelling of Telltale's first season of The Walking Dead, I wanted more. I was itching to know more about the fate of beloved characters like Clementine, Kenny, Krista, and Omid. Then once I finished Telltale's second season, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I kinda wanna see what happens to Jane, Kenny, and AJ, and Clementine, I think. But rather than focus on the main characters of the past, the writers put a new spin on things by emphasizing the struggles of a new bland family of people I don't care about enough to look up their names of right now. This really speaks to how unforgettable and how uninvested I was throughout. I was going through the motions out of obligation because I felt like I should know what happens to Clementine and other actually developed characters. To put insult to injury, the writers just completely retcon the past characters in the most stupid way. Kenny lets a child drive and fucking dies because Clementine crashes the car and he's totally fine with being left to be devoured by a few zombies. And then Jane... why? It's so dumb, and as for Clementine and AJ themselves, they're more of side characters to the aforementioned other flat characters. The entire experience is so boring, relying on the same tropes you've already seen a dozen times from a zombie survival narrative. A New Frontier is absolutely awful, but at the very least, I think the series is coming to a close soon, so that's cool. Bubsy, the Woolies strike back. Only number 3, I must have something really good for the other spots because objectively, this is the worst designed game of the year. This takes the cake for being a broken, poor-looking mess that I wouldn't wish upon anyone. For charging $30, it really makes you wonder how stupid Billionsoft, the people behind this charade, must expect other people to be. I know this was supposed to cash in on the trend of nostalgic icons coming back, and yeah, that's totally in Bubsy fashion to be hastily following in trends it can't ever live up to. The only issue is that the Woolies just want to be dead didn't have to be this horrible. You could have dragged Bubsy out of his self-induced coma, fixed him up, and delivered an experience for people to change their perception of Bubsy as a gaming legend. I don't know anyone who's a fan of Bubsy, but imagine if the developers took some time and energy to make actual fans through compelling design and enjoyable gameplay. Instead, Bubsy's revival uses the same assets, engine, and design from the developer's past. It's like throwing a bunch of garbage at a wall and selling whatever lands in a certain spot. There's nothing good about Bubsy Returns. The music is unforgettable, Bubsy's annoying and not funny, platforming is clunky and monotonous, and there was not a point where I had any semblance of fun. You can have some sick enjoyment of watching others torture themselves with a full playthrough, but talk about a waste of your dwindling time on Earth. Mass Effect Andromeda. Mass Effect is one of those special franchises, but it's published by EA. EA, otherwise known as EA, has made its fair share of great titles in the past without a lot of garbage in them. This was not their year, unfortunately, and they had a great start by rushing the development of Andromeda and massively underfunding production. Andromeda is just about the pinnacle of everything that sucks about EA's unrealistic development planning and lack of care for any sort of quality. The game is notorious for its wacky facial expressions, glitches, and gameplay mechanics that are simply broken or boring and confusing. As opposed to the other Mass Effect installments, the story is bland and has almost no dynamic characters that you can build meaningful relationships with throughout the experience. While you can find some simple joy in shooting things with lasers and exploring an open world, the harder you scrutinize Andromeda, the more you realize the true nature of its repetitive level design and meaningless combat. It's worse than just being a bad game. It's a disappointment for Mass Effect fans that waited 5 years for something to succeed the third title. This is a franchise beloved by millions and innovated RPGs as we know them today, with a past unique systems, compelling plots, and interesting dynamics with other characters you could choose how to bond with. Andromeda fails as a follow-up and as a game in general. Thanks, EA. Star Wars Battlefront 2. Haha, thank you again, EA. Now, Battlefront 2 is competently made, and the visuals are stunning. But this is my personal pick of the worst game of the year for a reason, and it largely has to do with my relationship to the Battlefront titles. The crux of my complaints with EA Front 2 is that it takes what made the original so enjoyable and extracts only the shoot other people with lasers part of it to try to make it into a reboot. The gameplay is painfully simplistic, and with a restrictive point system, lack of cool maps, and awful servers, combat never realizes its fullest creative potential. It lacks heart and soul as well as fascinating mechanics that could differentiate itself from the whole host of other mundane shooters on the market. EA chose to play it safe and rush it out like a droid on a Geonosian assembly line. Do you get the reference? Furthering that, you all know why it has to be number 1. The microtransactions that allow for purchasing and restricting gameplay elements. Loot boxes and making the cool things a bitch to unlock are the perfect way to wring more money out of players. You can catch them with a generally blind fun system and then demand so much time from them that they have no choice but to feel like they should just spend money instead. It feels manipulative and sets a dangerous precedent for the future of online games. Luckily, they seem to be responding to the loss of sales by temporarily taking out microtransactions, but that's not enough. Eliminate them completely. We know you love money, and if you need more, this is not the way to do it. Make money by being friendly to your fans, not at their expense. Sounds like a genius concept, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyways, this was my list of the worst games of the year. I hope you disagreed because I'd love to hear what games you thought were the worst. Let me know in the comment section below if you want. As always, thank you so much for watching and take care. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.